Welcome to Norse Code, the #1 podcast for your Minnesota Vikings. I'm your host, Dusty O'Connell, and joining me this week, as per usual, is Vikings blogger extraordinaire and generally useful human, Arif Hassan. How you doing, Arif?
I'm good. How are you?
I'm fantastic. That was a good pre-show warm-up. I got a lot of the laughter out, I think.
Yeah. We will not laugh for the rest of the episode.
We'll address this in the mailbag, but I had to warn our guest that there was a question coming about something that he may not have been previously aware, and it escalated rapidly. Speaking of guests, this week we've got one of the hosts of the Missed Opportunities podcast. No one knows more about the Panthers than him, but as far as I know, he's the only person that has said that. He's at Marxist Panther on Twitter.
There's a couple other people I would say know as much.
Oh, wow. All right.
Fair. Yeah.
The gauntlet has been thrown down by our guest, Scott Leedy. How you doing, Scott?
I am doing great. As you kind of alluded to, I just discovered that there is I don't know wealth, but there is at least a number of sort of, I guess what we would call sort of conservative board games, which we'll get to later. And that is sort of both shaken me and delighted me. So I guess I'm ready to do this podcast now.
All right.
Make America game again.
Yeah, there you go.
Before we get into the preview of the Panthers game, I wanted to take a minute and say thank you to Brad Davis, who just threw us $20 via the PayPal tip jar at paypal.me/NorseCode. And he includes a note, "It's been a while, so it's time to make another donation. You guys know I love you and the show, so I had to show you guys some love." Well, we appreciate that. Thank you. We are always happy to collect tips from the tip jar, especially as the holiday season approaches. And you can also contribute via Patreon, become a recurring monthly sponsor at patreon.com/NorseCode. However, and this is important news for anyone who already contributes to the show via Patreon, and even more important if you contribute to like multiple Patreon projects in small dollar amounts. Patreon is changing the way that it charges patrons fees for contributing to the works that they love. And they're really not being terribly honest about it when it comes to small dollar donations. I mean, we thrive.
Well, they're basically asking us to sell you on it.
Well, I'm going to do the opposite of that because Norse Code, we don't ask for a whole lot.
Actually are, yeah.
We thrive on, $3.50 donations, small donations. And the new change to the fee schedule is rather than charging patrons a percentage of their contribution, they're charging a percentage plus a flat 35-cent fee per donation. So if you donate $1 a month, then you're getting charged, $1.38 or something.
Yeah.
And of that, we only see like 90 cents. So like 60% of that donation, that $1 donation goes to the creator and the rest goes to Patreon. And Patreon is not being very honest about this. They are claiming that shows like us will get, 95% of every donation, which when you include the transaction fee, especially for low dollar donors, that no longer becomes true. And if you donate $1 a month to 10 different organizations, then you're paying, $3.50 a month in just transaction fees to Patreon. So we're not super thrilled about, well, and I get, it costs money to process transactions or whatever, but I'm not super thrilled with the lack of transparency.
Right.
And the kind of purposeful misleading that Patreon is doing on their website. So there'll be a link in the show notes where you can drop some feedback to Patreon if you think that this is a good idea or a bad idea.
Be completely honest.
Yeah, be
I
honest.
had another. I have something I subscribe to, and they were also sent like an email. They were pretty down on the whole thing as well. So I don't think this is an uncommon reaction from the various. I don't know, what do you call the one who's using Patreon? Because he calls theoretically the donators patrons. I guess the clients of Patreon.
Patreon calls us creators.
The language is
creators. There you go. Creators, sure.
But really, we are the conduit by which they get to collect money, and they have decided they are not. They're not merely like happy to take whatever percentage they were taking. They would like some more of your money patrons, so they're just going to take it, and that would be like if they were being more transparent. If I felt like they were being honest about what they're doing, then I might feel a little differently. But the way that they're really just kind of insulting the intelligence of small dollar donors. Like, you don't think I can't figure out that
doing it by transaction or by donor commitment instead of in sum total, it really kills the ability to give, like, spread out your patronage over multiple people, or it kills the ability of small donors. So if you feel like this, like, absolutely, makes it very difficult for you to give to a couple of patrons, definitely consolidate. Like, we don't want you to overextend yourselves. That would be awful, both for you and actually in the long run, us too. So just be aware that, like, Patreon is charging you for, like, every individual patronage. I'm calling them patronages. I don't know what they're called, but every commitment, right? And so if you're a small dollar, spread them out, kind of Patreon user, or if you're only giving to one or two things, well, first, thanks that you're giving to us as one of your one or two things. But second, just keep that in mind.
And one thing you can do, I mean, I fired off maybe not a nasty comment, but a critical comment, and I suggested charging each patron like once per month, like $1 per month per patron, so that, people can continue contributing $1 to, 5 or 10 different projects that they enjoy. And maybe that's something you can suggest as well if you would like to preserve your donation power and make sure that 40% of your donation isn't going into the pockets of Patreon.
Yeah, it's interesting because, like you were saying here, like I said, I subscribe to a couple, and they sent an email, and they're basically framing it like the reason they're doing this is so the creators can get more money. But I've now heard from you and another creator that's like the opposite.
Yeah,
of what's
none of these transaction fees go to us. All those transaction fees go directly into Patreon's pocket, and they changed the percentage amount that creators get paid slightly. But we don't really have any like $100 a month patrons. Like, we're not
so ridiculous. They're still taking like the quote unquote money commitment away from, like, it would be completely different if like 100% of the pledge to donation goes to patrons. A little different, but like still, like, there's a 5% like take off the top to the creators as well. And so there's the 2.9% to the patrons, I guess. Plus the additional 35-cent fee, and also the 5% from like, guys.
Right. Yeah. Well, and it's not surprising that they're trying to repackage, it as something that's actually good for the people using the service when it's not.
Well, because they want us to sell it. Because the reason that we're receiving these donations is because, like, people are really committed to our creative efforts. Which, again, thank you. But it, like, really awful.
But they want to take advantage of that.
They want to just watch all this money go by. They want more of it.
The guy, you clearly have a monetizable personality. Use it for our benefit. And it's like, we already were. But...
Yeah, that's what we were doing. So, check out the link if you want to send Patreon a note. And if you are not comfortable with the new transaction fee schedule, then one-time donations at paypal.me/NorseCode are always welcome. Now then, after nearly an hour, we are finally going to talk about football. We're heading to Carolina to take on the Khalil brothers and some other guys. Actually, like a third of your starters are former Vikings or something, right?
A third of our starters. I have
maybe
no
not
idea
a third.
That's true. I could see that.
That's pushing. It's maybe like 3 guys.
3 divided by 22, it's a third.
Yeah, I guess if you count like players like Kirk Coleman as a former Viking, yeah, definitely. Which, yeah, he was in camp. Actually, I think it might actually be 3. That's pretty fun. So, let's talk about the Panthers. We'll do like a I mean, you've listened to the show before, so you kind of know what the format is for us asking other people about the teams.
Sure.
But I wanted to ask just about the Panthers in general. They're like a team that I don't have a very good handle on because, one week they look pretty great, another week they don't look that great. But they're 8-4. They're in the race for the NFC, the tougher of the two conferences to qualify for the playoffs at the moment, and they're currently in probably the best division in either conference right now.
Yeah.
What are your thoughts about their ability to make the playoffs?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. I mean, you're kind of asking how good do I think they are in one way, and then what's their schedule? Right? Yeah. No, it's a two-part question. As far as, and you're not wrong, they're a difficult team to get a hold of. I feel like, I said this to you in the chat. I feel like, in the NFL, most people really only know their own team, and then they don't really know what they're talking about when they try to talk about somebody else's team. And I think that holds true to about 99% of the time. And I will say, as someone who obviously knows the Panthers very well, I don't really have a great handle on them either. So you're not wrong to say that it's difficult to figure out how good they are. I would say part of that is just the nature of football in general. It's very difficult to tell how good teams are. And that goes into a lot of issues with just sample size and the way football is played as a low scoring opportunity game. But I feel relatively confident that they will make the playoffs. Part of the reason for that is that their schedule is tough, but when you look at basically every contending team for a wild card, they're all tough. I think all the schedules are pretty difficult.
And a lot of those teams have additional hurdles to clear because they don't have 8 wins, right? And so the Falcons have 7, sure, but like the Lions,
but they played the Saints twice.
6, the Cardinals have 5, the Cowboys have 6.
Right. Yeah. So the team, I don't think any of those teams are going to, like, to me, it's sort of a 3-team race with the sort of maybe the Packers situation. To me, it's Atlanta, Seattle, and Carolina are probably going to be, in my mind, the wild card teams. Wacky things happen. So I'm not really in the business of predicting the NFL because I think predicting the NFL is like an insane person's job. But as reasonably as you can, I would say that those are the 3 teams I see as legit wild card contenders. Again, with the caveat that, if Aaron Rodgers comes back and Green Bay, I think they have Cleveland this weekend. If they win that game and then, they win out with Rodgers at quarterback, I think that gets them to 10 wins. Yeah. So, or maybe even 11. I think it gets them to 10. But I don't have the standings in front of me. So even though their schedule is tough and it sucks that they might be the team that plays Rodgers, when he comes back, I think they'll get to 10 wins. Now, if you ask me which games are they winning to get to, 10 wins, and I think 10 wins will ultimately get them one of the wild card spots. But if you ask me which games are they going to win, I don't honestly know. I think they'll, will certainly win the Buccaneers game. But other than that, the other 3, what I think they'll do, this is my honest opinion, is I think they'll win the Buccaneers game. They could obviously screw that up.
Right.
But it's the NFL, that happens. And the Panthers aren't a dominant team. So, I think they'll win one of the Falcon, Packers, Vikings games. And they could win 11, they could win none of those games. That's part of the difficulty, but I think they're a solidly good team, and it's a difficult schedule, but I think they should be able to win 2 of the next 4.
All right. Well, let's talk about the specific matchups, which is, kind of, I think the feature of the way that we bring on guests is to talk about sort of the position groups one by one. So the primary question regarding the Panthers, there's a lot of talented players. Everyone loves Luke Kuechly. Vikings fans are a little bit interested in sort of how Captain Munnerlyn is doing, whatever. But the primary question, of course, is Cam Newton. He's got a thumb injury, or he did have one pretty recently. He's been pretty inconsistent this season, but his highs have been really high and his lows have been pretty low. So why don't you tell me about Newton just in general?
Yeah. So my evaluation of Cam Newton is going to be kind of on an extreme end compared to most people. And part of that is just the way that I think about the quarterback position and the way that, other people tend to think about the quarterback position, and the generic other people, whatever that really means.
Right.
But I think, for most of his career, ironically, outside of his rookie year, the surrounding talent has been pretty bad for the most part. And I think that the 2015 season stands as one of the few examples of a quarterback having a great statistical season with a relatively mediocre to, below mediocre supporting cast on the whole. And part of that is just because of what he was able to do. He was basically able to be a huge plus in the passing game and the running game at the same time. And that's schematically speaking. I mean, a lot of people have been over this, but you know that he's able to sort of do a lot of different things in the running game. But as it goes to this season, I mean, you're not wrong that his play has been inconsistent, though. I would argue that basically a lot of that has to do with coming off the shoulder injury. And I think basically since the first Saints game, his play has remained relatively stable. If you use things like QBR, things like that, you'll see a lot of peaks and valleys. I, more or less don't think that individual quarterback statistics, at least statistics that try to capture the quality of play, are useful. When you talk about, say, what a quarterback, everything that goes into what happens in a particular play for a quarterback, and then try to reduce that down to a number, I just don't really see how that can possibly actually capture what's happening in a particularly useful way. But again, that gets back to more my philosophy about football and my philosophy about the quarterback position. So I think since the early season, and it's still obviously bothering him, they still list him as I don't know, bothering him is the right word, but it's still somewhat of a limitation. They still list him as limited in practice regularly with a shoulder injury. I think the biggest thing that's different about Cam Newton this year that's been true almost consistently up until the last few weeks is that, and I heard you talking about this in another podcast, is Cam Newton is probably, one of the, 2 or 3 best sort of what you would call, what Pro Football Focus calls big time throw quarterback.
Yeah.
Yeah. Just in terms of, even last year when he, had that awful completion percentage, again, outside of injury, I actually thought he played very well. Not that different from his MVP campaign. Just the team around him fell apart. He was still regularly making just absolutely absurd throws down the field into tight windows, throwing guys open. And that's, because of his arm strength, obviously is a huge part of it. And sort of the way he throws the ball, he gets a lot of griefs, some deserved about his mechanics, but the way he throws the ball, which is with a lot of torque through his midsection and his hips, allows him to make throws from muddy pockets that basically no other quarterback can make. He's actually not that good throwing it on the run, which is sort of funny because people say he's like this scrambling style quarterback, but he's actually not a scrambler at all for the most part.
Right. Oh yeah. So this is so let's branch off a little bit on this question. So running quarterbacks tend to get compared to each other, and there are too many passing quarterbacks for passing quarterbacks to be compared to each other. And I remember thinking about this. Maybe the first time I thought about this was when Joe Webb was signed, by the Panthers. And I was like, I actually don't think Joe Webb is a very good fit as a quarterback for the offense. Not because he's a bad quarterback. That's another reason. But I'm sorry, Joe Webb, love you. But because they use their running in different ways. Like, so Russell Wilson as a quarterback is a much different sort of quarterback with his legs than Cam Newton is. And I think they're both different than Michael Vick in terms of the way that they use their legs and the way that they use their mobility as part of the weapon. And I think this is a really good example of that, how Cam Newton doesn't really use his mobility to buy time in the pocket. He uses his size to buy time in the pocket because he's like pretty confident he can shrug off, sacks, and that works a lot of times. But like very often when he uses his mobility, he's using it to run forward, right?
Yeah, well, I would disagree with that a little bit. What I would say is that Russell Wilson doesn't use his mobility to buy time in the pocket. Russell Wilson uses his mobility to just basically completely break the pocket and do totally different things.
Right.
He's a very improvisational player. I made this point earlier today, and I preface this by saying I think Russell Wilson is one of the 5 best quarterbacks in the league, but I think he does this thing where he makes things look way more difficult than they actually are, partly just by the way he plays. And it's fine. It works. It's brilliant. But then people think that like basically the line at hike is all falling down, tripping over themselves, and he's forced to run around on every play. And I contend that that's not the case, while saying that I'm not somebody that thinks you have to play the quarterback position in a particular way. And I think he's great at throwing the football. He's maybe the best improvisational playmaking quarterback I've ever seen. And it's infuriating to root against him. But I do think that a lot of his a lot of what he does is sort of every player, what they're good at kind of has a double edge. And I think the double edge for him is that he does just sort of abandon pockets immediately sometimes, whether they're clean or not. And Cam Newton is much more, and this is going to sound like an odd comparison, but he's much more like sort of like honestly kind of like a Tom Brady in terms of that he's going to stay in the pocket and try to manipulate the pocket with his mobility rather than just break it. Right. I hear he'll try to, use his size, but he's not like Big Ben necessarily in that he's like just going to sit there and shrug off guys constantly. Okay. A little bit that I think that is more of an offensive design issue, just in terms of that they try to throw down the field a lot. And you've seen this with Brady this year. He's taken a lot more hits because they're trying to throw the ball down the field. So even if you're great at manipulating the pocket, if your offense is asking you to hold on to the ball, you're just going to take more hits. There's just no way around that. Not to say, I'm not trying to say he doesn't use his size. He definitely does. But Cam Newton is actually much more of a traditional pocket passer than I would say just about any other young quarterback in the league. I often say him and Andrew Luck are actually not that different of players stylistically, which is kind of interesting to me. And they've been asked to do similar things.
Do you agree with that, especially given how much Luck loved to take chances?
Yeah, they both are big-time throwers. They both are very patient and nuanced in the pocket, which comes with its own downsides when you build a vertical offense around them, which I don't necessarily disagree with, but especially when you build a vertical offense around them and don't surround them with good talent, which neither of them have been surrounded with good talent. So
yeah, let's talk a little bit more about, because I'm just way more interested in this discussion about Cam Newton than I am about like literally anyone on this offensive line. Cam is one of the most fascinating players. That's part of why I gravitate towards him. And I think that he's such a fascinating player because I think that you have to do a lot of work to really understand his play versus like, it's not hard to watch and be like, Tom Brady's great. Like he's had great coaching and great surrounding talent his whole career. So it's not hard to figure out that he's great. There's no difficulty in that. Right. No, yeah, absolutely. So one of the things that I always find interesting is that I think for the Panthers in particular, the way, say, Pro Football Focus evaluates play, I'm not going to say it gets broken, but it gets kind of weird. So one of the things that, you're right. Like one of the things that I find...
Well, I would say it's broken to begin with, but yeah, that's a whole nother discussion. We're not going to get into that. Yeah.
But one of the things that I find kind of interesting is one of the stats they have, which I think is actually a useful statistic, but needs to be understood kind of within its context, is accuracy, which gets rid of drops, spikes, throwaway. Right. Sure. It counts drops as accurate passes, which is like fine. I'm totally on board with that. Right. And Cam Newton has one of the lowest. I think he's like the fifth lowest in accuracy, right next to like Jameis Winston and Carson Wentz. Sure. Palmer, who take chances. Right. And a lot of people think that this is a pretty good argument about their overall accuracy. And I can understand, like, obviously besides the name, I can understand why this like is appealing, but also I think for the Panthers in particular, it creates a problem where if you throw guys open and they're not good at tracking the ball, that counts as an inaccurate pass, just as one example. And it still relies on a bunch of receiver talent in order for it to get. They have to like run open routes and stuff like that in order to get there. So what do you think about Cam Newton's accuracy? Because a lot of people are like, he's inaccurate except when he's super accurate, and I feel like that just logically doesn't make sense. Like, because sometimes he's threading needles, right? So
yeah. No, actually, I don't think that's a bad way of looking at it in terms of that. Bo Jackson on Twitter, Eric Stoner, who's not on Twitter anymore, right, once made the point that there's a difference between like being consistently inaccurate and, missing a throw, having a wild miss every once in a while. Mm-hmm. And I think that, and he said that, Cam Newton is more of the latter than the former. When he's accurate, very accurate, to the point where he's, like you said, putting the ball on people. And I'm glad you brought up the accuracy percentage thing because it's a really great point. And I actually at one point talked with even Kean Fahey about this. He does charting for accuracy percentage, and he admitted, and this is one of the things too I think people need to understand about advanced analytics in general, is that it all depends on charting pretty much regardless. And charting is still a subjective process, and also there are always limitations to what you're charting. So, like you mentioned. And Kean even conceded this even for his stuff, is that there's going to be a difference between if you're constantly having to try to throw into tight windows versus if you get to throw to wide open receivers all the time. They're just easier throw. Like as a quarterback, that that you're trying to throw into a tighter window. And so you have to do different things with the ball. You have to try and, throw it harder, throw it higher, throw it lower, whatever. And your window for error is much smaller versus if you have a guy running wide open over the middle of the field, it's a much just easier throw. And even if, yes, you can still miss that throw, but I would argue it's harder to miss that throw than it is to miss a throw that requires a lot more.
Well, right. So just as an example, especially for early season Case Keenum, say Adam Thielen's running across and he's wide open and Case kind of throws behind him. He's wide open. It hurts his, yards after the catch and all that. Fine. But he turns around, he has to contort his body, he has to grab it, but he grabs it. That counts as an accurate throw by PFF. That same player is covered. You put the ball in the same spot because you're just not an accurate quarterback, or the timing is off, or whatever. And you throw it behind him. Suddenly, it lands on the DB's hip or something. They maybe have the ability to intercept them, and that same quarterback might do the same thing. Because they're working off of a couple steps, like they're working off of like a design mechanical footwork. Maybe they're not thinking too much, or they're not a talented quarterback, whatever. But one gets charted as accurate, one does not.
Well, and another thing that, and this will get into the whole thing about Cam Newton, obviously, is that one thing that also infuriates me, and this is, you'll remember the Eagles game on Thursday night.
I don't know what you're talking about.
Yeah, well, So one of the things that gets interesting to me is you'll see a throw, say, and I don't, there was a number of throws like this in the game, particularly late in the game when people thought Cam Newton's arm has died, including myself until I went back and watched the film. And there were a number of throws that people were like, oh, that was a terrible throw, and then just moved on. But if you go back and watch, like, at least a couple of them, one in particular, as he's throwing, he gets whacked on the arm. And just no one pointed it out. And so when you have this perception of just not being an accurate quarterback, people just accept that you missed the throw because you can't throw the ball.
Right.
And I wonder, and that's why I also wonder with PFF with these accuracy percentages is that, often in his career, Newton has also struggled with having sort of the double combo of lines that can't protect very effectively and receivers that can't separate. So now if you're trying to make throws into tight windows and you're dealing with pressure at the same time, because I don't think PFF says, oh, that quarterback was under pressure, we're not going to chart this throw. They have like a separate
statistic for when, and they only rolled this out this year, but accuracy in clean pockets. I actually should look at that right now. But
and I'm sure he's not high on that either, to be honest, just given again, some of the issues we already discussed. And even accuracy in clean pockets, let's talk about that. This gets into another issue with Cam Newton's accuracy and just his general struggles. Is that, so there's a very famous NFL play called, the sail play or the 3-level stretch, which is just basically one receiver runs a vertical route, another receiver runs a corner route, and another receiver runs a flat route. Basically just meant to, put a certain zone defender, basically the flat defender, because you clear out the deep defender. It puts the flat defender in a bind between, do I take, really the goal of the play is to draw the flat defender up to hit the sail route behind. So what the Panthers do often, because their line can't protect reliably, and there's some nuances to this, they actually, when Curtis Samuel was healthy right after they traded Kelvin Benjamin, they tried to move to some more quick, so they can't really run a quick passing game because they don't have the receivers to get open to do it. When they had Curtis Samuel, Devin Funchess, and Russell Shepard on the field, they tried to do that and actually had some decent success. Samuel gets hurt. They really can't do that. We've seen a little bit of them go back to more of what I'm about to talk about, which is what they'll keep 7 in to protect. Now, what happens on that sail concept, what you'll see them do, and this will happen, is basically the flat route is now a chipper. So if the flat route chips, he's now out late. And if that player's out late, there's no longer a stretch between the basically the intermediate route and the flat route, because that corner has nothing to worry about. He just gains depth the entire time. And then often that player is not out in time for Cam to make that throw. So you see how everything around him and the adjustments they have to make for scheme, it just makes his job often borderline impossible. So and that's why he's such a difficult evaluation. It's, if the situation were better, would he play better? I would say yes, because generally when the play around him is good, he performs at a very, very high level. Now, like any quarterback, he's going to have bad games. And part of the issue with the perception of Cam Newton is the perception we have of elite quarterbacks in general, which is this idea that they just don't make mistakes at all, which I've watched, plenty of film of guys like Tom Brady and others to know that that's just not the case. So this is getting back to the question of, is he an accurate quarterback? I think the problem is he has a certain perception. So when he misses a throw, it's a big deal. When he makes and it sort of also trickles into when he makes say a tight window throw or places the ball behind a receiver because there's coverage in front of him. So basically trying to protect his receiver or any number of other things that another quarterback would get credit for doing. And they would say, wow, what a great play by Tom Brady. What a great play by Drew Brees. They'll say, well, that was a bad throw and he made his receiver make a difficult play. And I think that regardless of how smart you are, regardless of how on top of it you are, if you're just watching the game casually, it's easy to just sort of buy into what the announcers are saying. And so I tend to contend that Cam Newton is actually a very accurate quarterback. Does he miss high now and again? Yeah. Does he struggle with every once in a while with the throw that you just feel like, other quarterbacks wouldn't? Sure. But on the whole, I think the inaccuracy thing is really overblown.
So would you say, and not that like accuracy is like a very useful like global concept, but it's, a decent shorthand. Would you say that among like starting quarterbacks, and I'm saying quarterbacks that probably should be starting this year, so like Deshaun Watson instead of Tom Savage, Aaron Rodgers, like a stable, like, totally. Yeah. Would you say that he's in the top half in terms of accuracy among quarterbacks, just as a general concept?
Oh, yeah. I don't even think that's remotely close. Yeah. I think if you adjust for scheme and separation and the types of throws he's being asked to make, when healthy. I think this year's been a little weird because and this is what I kind of never got to make this point, but normally he has an absolutely great, an excellent deep ball. And this year that's been like the one area that I feel like up until very recently, he's still struggled with. And then, there was the Jets game where he if you watch that game, you would think, yeah, Cam Newton is an inaccurate quarterback. But I just have a hard time believing it wasn't the thumb injury because the week, basically the Miami game, the Atlanta game before that, and then the game after that, the New Orleans game, he looked great throwing the ball. So I have a hard time believing that it's not the thumb because I've just never seen him look that bad throwing the ball except for late last year when he was dealing with the shoulder injury more significantly.
All right. Let's so final question then. Is he a top 5 quarterback this year based on his performance if you do not adjust for injury?
No, this is, I told you earlier, you don't know, but the teams that you watch, right, you don't know,
give me a general understanding of what it means to be a top 5. So you don't have to name the 5 or 4 quarterbacks.
Yeah, no, I would say that. So you're saying not adjusting for injury, has he played
just how has the performance from the quarterback position?
Yeah, I would say second half of the year I would say he's been at that level. I would say about the first half he was more in sort of like the 10 to 15 range, just given his injury limitations. So not adjusting for injury, then I would say he wasn't. But I would say since they traded Kelvin Benjamin, basically, I would say he's more, and I guess that includes the Jets game, but so then I guess it would be a no. But outside of the Jets game, then I would say he's been at that level. He's been playing like Cam Newton since the second half of the year, But yeah, so on the whole for the season, no, not if you're not accounting for injury, I would say he hasn't been at that level because of those limitations. But I think he's starting to, that's what I think makes them dangerous to me as a team is that I don't think the talent on the whole is as good as it should be around him and Luke Kuechly. But they have 2 guys that can really elevate the talent around them. They basically have 2 elite players that sort of carry, and this has been true for a long time, that kind of carry this franchise and make up for a lot of its mistakes.
Yeah, well, let's talk a little bit about that supporting cast. So, like at tight end, we've got at Dixon, I think Greg Olson is good to go ish, right? Well, yes, that's the interesting thing. We don't know. So he had this Jones fracture, had the surgery. As probably a lot of your listeners know, and it's a little bit of a tricky injury to recover for. Football is so great because he's playing on it, but the bone's not fully healed, and that's just like a thing that people do in football apparently. Right, so
it's a little interesting to know to kind of gauge what's going to happen. So he played in the Jets game, had a little soreness. It wasn't really considered a setback. It's just part of any injury recovery, especially these. They just want to make sure you don't refracture it. So no, he had MRI. He's fine. He didn't play in the Saints game. It sounds like the main reason behind that is because the game was on turf. Whether that's a legitimate reason not to play, I don't know. I'm not familiar necessarily with whether that really matters. But I also think it made a level of sense just in terms of also he gets an extra week of rest. Ron Rivera came out this week and said that he has no limitations. There's no snap count. Now, that I don't know that means a lot because if his foot starts to get sore, he won't play, right?
Right.
So just the fact there's no snap
there's
count.
No limitations going in, right? We
right.
Yeah. So
exactly. So that's the question
game evolves, they'll adapt to what they're presented with.
Right. And obviously if he can come out and play and be close to 100% makes a huge difference. But I'm as any fan I think should be, I'm quietly optimistic that that's the case, but we just don't really know until he gets out there and plays again.
So, that would leave the total number of interesting targets to 3, right? If he's healthy, it'd be Devin Funchess and Christian McCaffrey.
Yeah.
Is that right?
Yeah. I think that's fair. I mean, you got guys like Kalen Clay and Damiere Byrd who are interesting from like a speed perspective.
Right.
Maybe they can be like a kind of Ted Ginn threat, but that hasn't really materialized this year yet. It's a real bummer that Curtis Samuel got hurt because I was very high on him both in the pre-draft process and I thought he was starting to look really good. But no. So that now if it's Olson, we have 3. If there, and it really gets to be a problem if there's no Olson because there's really 2.
Right. Well, so let's talk about these matchups. So if Xavier Rhodes is fully healthy, which ostensibly he was last week, but I think the evidence that we saw from his play was that he probably wasn't.
Right.
If Xavier Rhodes is healthy, I would expect him to shadow Devin Funchess from a technical skill standpoint. That makes a ton of sense. Also, big on big, that makes a ton of sense. You put your best players on their best.
Yeah. And it sounds like he tends to shadow people. Yes,
he tends to. This last game, he didn't. That's fine.
Even into the slot.
This year a lot more. That one's a little bit more flexible, I guess. He doesn't always, and he used to just not follow people into the slot. But this year he's been following people to the slot with a little bit more consistency. You're more likely to shake him, as it were, in terms of pre-snap coverage by moving into the slot. But he's still, likely to follow players into the slot now.
Gotcha.
So he's likely to match up against Devin Funchess. Pick a guy. That's probably who Waynes is going to get. Russell Shepard, who was going to be converted to defensive back, according to NFL draft experts before the draft. Or Kalen Clay or whoever. They're going to go up against Waynes. Then you've got kind of the running back safety deal with the Greg Olson, Christian McCaffrey. Personally, I'd probably, if I were going to do man coverage assignments, which is not really how the Vikings work, but I would put Smith on Greg Olson more often than not. I'd put Anthony Barr on Christian McCaffrey more often than not. When you hear that, Funchess on Rhodes, Barr on McCaffrey, Smith on Olson, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, Devin Funchess has played very, very well. And that was a player that when they drafted him, that was before I really spent a lot of time doing any kind of evaluation of players or looking at players when they're drafted. But I will say, since he's come into the league, I've always thought he was a much more interesting player than Kelvin Benjamin, who they traded. I think because Funchess ran a 4.7 at the combine, people have this idea that he's not a good athlete. But he, I think, ran like a 4.45 at his pro day. And I know people look down sometimes on pro day numbers, but given what I've seen from him in the NFL, I think that 4.45 is legit. I think he does have that level of athleticism. Matt Waldman has recently compared him stylistically to Julio Jones, which I actually don't think is a bad comparison. What I said on Twitter is that he has a similar style to Julio in that he moves very fluidly and explosively, more so than he should for someone that size. The difference is that Funchess is a very good athlete for his size. Julio is like the elite of the elite athlete for his size. And, Devin Funchess is never going to change that. So he's never going to be Julio Jones, in terms of the quality of player, obviously. But in terms of, and all that being said, so Funchess has played very, very well. There was a stat recently that he was, since the Kelvin Benjamin trade, or maybe just after, he's 5th in yards per route run, which is an astonishing stat to me because he has left a lot of plays on the field. And the number one area that he needs to improve on is making catches in tight windows. He's very good at tracking the ball, very good at adjusting to them, but then just doesn't catch the ball. So, it'd be interesting to see if that's something he can or can't improve on. But he's a very savvy player. Oh, sorry,
sure.
Go for it.
No, keep going.
No, he's a very savvy player, understands very well now how to work open against zone. So that'll be interesting. I don't know how much man you guys play versus how much zone you guys play. Because I think while he's capable of winning in man coverage, I think a lot of his ability comes in understanding and adjusting to zone. But if you're asking me, do I think he's going to do well against Xavier Rhodes? Probably not. I mean, that the odds on bet are, I think, maybe in a year or two, that would be a much more interesting matchup. And I honestly, I won't be surprised if he does play well, just because he is a very good athlete. He has been playing very well. But, if you're going to ask me, do I think he's going to have a good game against one of the best cornerbacks in the NFL? My answer is going to be no, probably not. But whereas like a year ago, I would have said it's impossible. Now I think it's within the reason. It's within a range of outcomes that could occur.
Right. So my next question is Cam Newton overcome the talent difference between the top receiver and the top cornerback?
Yeah, I mean, I don't. In that, I think the question more is, can Cam Newton overcome the differences in talent on the offense overall versus the talents in the defense overall?
Yeah.
I think it's a tall task against the Minnesota defense. And I think that's really their main chance of winning. I think he's, again, a good enough quality player that he can do that. But, we've seen even with Aaron Rodgers, who's the best quarterback I've ever seen, that he often can't overcome the Minnesota defense or the Mike Zimmer defense. So, and again, if I'm going to bet on that, no, probably not, even as good as he is. But I do think it's possible. And we can get to, I think that the offensive line is really one of the areas that's going to be interesting for that, in terms of whether they can run the ball, whether they can pass protect. But yeah, no, I mean, I think on the whole, all these matchups, McCaffrey will be interesting. I don't know how good a coverage, linebacker Anthony Barr is. I tend to
than he was.
Right. I tend to think that regardless of how good they are, they going to have a tough time staying with McCaffrey. Now you've seen, and I don't know again how the Vikings do it. You've seen a lot more teams have really tried to do whatever they can to avoid McCaffrey on a linebacker, sometimes to the detriment of their coverage, basically busting their coverage because they're trying to adjust and make sure a linebacker isn't covering McCaffrey. So I don't know what the Vikings will do with that. But when they motion him out wide, when they motion him into a type, a stack or a type formation, which they'll do on third down to get him isolated to run just like a quick out route or a two-way go. I think that's maybe the one area where they might have an advantage. Olson versus Smith. Again, I know Harrison Smith's really good. I don't know what the level of his coverage skills are. And it's an injured Greg Olson, but I'll take Olson against most safeties, if he's healthy. So on the whole, it's not a great matchup, obviously, because I think you have one of the best sort of, I would say just, pass defenses in general against what is at this point a relatively limited group of players. Though if Olsen plays, it's maybe, better, slightly better than limited, maybe more towards average.
So one of the things that keeps coming up in terms of this matchup, and one of the things that makes the Vikings defense, I think, as good as it does, is how talented that defensive line is, how much of a problem that offensive line is going to be.
Time to talk about Matt Khalil.
Yeah, let's talk about how's that working.
And this is actually something I wanted to talk to you about because I'm just interested what his time was like there in Minnesota. I know we talked about this a long time ago, but honestly, I can't remember what you said. One of the things that's interesting to me about Khalil's play, particularly as of late, is that let's just take the Saints game, this past game. If you go back and you watch the tape, he obviously was asked to block Cameron Jordan a fair amount. And there are not an insignificant number of reps where he does a very good job against one of the better pass rushers in the NFL. And I would argue that with Khalil this year with the Panthers, there are certainly plenty of highlight clips of him just getting roasted by some guy, and that's fine. But to me, that if that was all that was the problem, he would actually be a pretty good left tackle in pass protection. To me, what part of the problem is that the other plays that he has where he just makes gigantic mental mistakes, like just completely blows the protection, doesn't understand his assignment. And then obviously, like I've never seen this before. I don't know if you're watching the game, but he had a rep against Cameron Jordan where he committed a holding penalty and a face mask in the same blocking rep while still allowing Cameron Jordan to hit the quarterback while he was throwing.
Definitely seen similar stuff. Not
that was pretty incredible.
Him, but like
it was pretty incredible.
I've seen him commit a holding penalty on a sack.
Yeah, so I'm just curious, as to if, like I said, it's just interesting to me that lately it feels like he actually has been doing a pretty decent job in pass protection, actually. And in the Saints game, a lot of it was just terrible mental errors, the stuff where he negatively affected the offense. So it's just like, if he could clean that up, and I don't know if that's consistent with how he played in Minnesota. I know there were years, I think, and I do think he's legitimately healthier. Like, I do think he's legitimately potentially moving better. But I'm just curious if the sort of mental aspect was something that he struggled with in Minnesota at all.
No, I mean, just to, I think that at the risk of sounding kind of flat and one-dimensional about a player that people don't like, I think that that's just an improvement. I think that technically speaking, he actually wasn't very sound. And I'm
not sure he's technically sound, but he's getting the job done one way or another.
No, he wasn't really doing that in Minnesota. So it wasn't just like, he'd make mental errors on a consistent, which he would. He'd make mental errors on a consistent basis. That wasn't the only type of problem that he would have. And so, 1 year, he consistently set too far to the outside. He got beat to the inside often. He learned from that and then sort of overcompensated for that and didn't get to the edge quickly enough, which counts kind of in the mental error sort of category as kind of a macro level thing because it was kind of his approach to playing the tackle position, but also just meant that there were just not many reps where he would just be locking someone up. So that is a change, despite the fact that like he's still giving up a ton of pressure this year.
Yeah, well, I think a lot of that's coming more from earlier in the season. I think it's been a little late. He definitely was a lot worse earlier in the year, like you're saying, where there weren't a lot of positive reps, to point you
Except
to. I just feel like
screen passes in Minnesota, he was friggin' phenomenal.
Yeah, I heard you talk about that. That's kind of funny. I don't know that I've noticed that necessarily. And earlier in the year, he was a horrible run blocker. I think that's improved a little bit too. Now, again, he's not all of a sudden like the world's best left tackle, but considering sort of the expectations and the narrative around him, I feel like. And the other thing to note is that
a little bit the sort of the narrative in just at least a little bit, if not
a little bit, yeah. Again, he's still. And the other thing I'd say about him is they ask him to do a difficult job, whereas they do not ask Darryl Williams to do a difficult job. They ask him to block one-on-one most of the time. To play action, slide. There are situations where they don't, but they don't send help his way nearly as often as they send help Darryl Williams' way.
So let's talk about that. Everson Griffin, Defensive Player of the Year candidate, should probably lose to Bobby Wagner. I don't care. He's playing really well. He's been chipped, according to NFL Next Gen stats, and I think PFF. I think they both have the same stat there. He's been chipped more often than any other edge rusher in the NFL.
Yeah.
And honestly, I mean, people kind of overload it. It's still less than half of his pass rushing snaps, but still.
Well, it's just hard, like, for an offense to really, like, it would be hard for it to be much higher than that, to be honest. Like, would be really compromising your offense if you did that.
We've seen the Vikings do it.
Yeah, but that doesn't mean it's a good idea.
Yeah, right. Yeah, it was previous iterations of the bad Vikings offense are not things to model. But I mean, Kyle Rudolph was basically nearly vocal about that. He's like, the reason I didn't get Pro Bowl votes this year is because I was chipping people.
Chipping literally on every play. Yeah.
Like, sure. I mean, okay, dude. But
I sympathize with him. It's tough because people don't.
It is. But because you got Everson Griffin, who's been the subject of a lot of offensive help and assistance, and then you've got Matt Khalil, who's been asked to do a lot, sort of by himself. Did the Panthers choose to break that tie, knowing that doing so would expose Darryl Williams to Danielle Hunter? What do you think the strategy or approach is going to be to Everson Griffin? And a bonus question: how many pressures do you think Everson Griffin gets?
Well, how many pressures does he about average a game? Because I don't know. I don't keep track of pressures. I have no idea. So what's his, if I'm going to answer that question, I have to have some idea what his baseline is.
Sure. Well, so it gets a little complicated because he played real awful right after he came back from injury.
Right. And when he's playing well, what do you think his baseline is?
So if we're using PFF's definition, which is different than NFL Next Gen Stats definition, it's like 6.
Yeah, it was funny. I did some charting earlier in the year, and I stopped because it literally takes like 5 hours to chart, even just like the offense. But it's so funny to like try and ask yourself, like, what is a pressure? Like, that is actually a much more complicated question than you would think.
Right. Yeah.
But that's again gets into the difficulty of just stats in general. But so the question in terms of scheme, I don't really know. They did a little bit of chipping Cameron Jordan when he was on the left side, but not very often. My guess is it'll be. Not going to do it
to Cameron Jordan. They probably won't to Everson then.
Yeah, I would imagine they'll try to get away with it without. The thing to watch for is, like I said, they will run a lot of play action, max protect, or just max protect in general, like 7 guys in which case there's 7 guys to block 4 or 5, however many the Vikings end up sending. So that's not a chip. They won't chip off of that usually necessarily. Right. So that's something I would watch out for more than a chip is are they doing a lot of heavy protection stuff?
Sure.
That would be my guess as to their adjustment to. And it'll be interesting if Olson is truly back, if they're willing to go, because Olson, is a good route runner. He can separate, generally a little easier earlier in the down than some of the other guys. It'll be interesting to see if they're more comfortable going to a little bit more quick game. Like I said, when they had Curtis Samuel, who was their best quick game player, I guess him and McCaffrey, they looked to do that a little bit more, which was really nice. But since he's been hurt, it's just been a little bit more difficult to have an extra receiver when that receiver can't reliably separate. So they've gone back a little bit more to that max protection thing. How many pressures for Griffin? If he averages 5 to 6, I'll go with, I don't think he's going to, the optimism in me says he's not going to absolutely tee off him. I think what's going to happen, honestly, is I don't think it's going to be a situation where Matt Khalil is just an outright liability the entire game. What I fear more is that he's going to give up the sack fumble or just some really big plays, because that seems to be his thing this year more than constant pressure issues is just giving up the worst play.
Mistakes.
Yeah, just unnecessary holding penalty or face mask penalty, or again he just completely doesn't understand the protection scheme for some reason and lets his defender run straight to the quarterback. That's happened an unnatural number of times this year to Matt Khalil, where he's just let the guy run by it. Like it's not even he's bad at blocking, he did a bad job. You know what I mean? You can't even say, he lost that rep, because he never even did the rep to begin with. So it's kind of weird, because it's on the one hand, he didn't do a bad job in terms of blocking that guy, but on the other hand, he never tried to block the guy, which is the worst job you can do. So that's my fear, is less that it'll be constant pressure. I mean, other than that, Everson Griffen's a great player, and so he might just, he might just create constant pressure because he's Everson Griffin. But I'm not as much worried about it in terms of a relative to Matt Khalil thing as I am just Khalil just doing, 2 or 3 or 4 just absolutely terrible plays that get Cam Newton, either a turnover or worse, injured. So I'm honestly just hoping that Cam Newton doesn't get hurt in this game, if we're being completely honest. That's my number one goal, is that Cam Newton is healthy.
Aim high.
Yeah.
What do you think? Do you think the history between Everson Griffin and Matt Khalil will play a role either positively or negatively?
It's interesting. They asked Khalil about that, and I think he sort of subtly admitted that he used to get roasted in practice, because he was like, I was hurt back then, so he must have just been getting absolutely demolished during practice, because you don't say, if it was okay, you don't say, I was hurt back then. You just say, yeah.
I'm glad he did.
Yeah, so he must. I mean, he didn't say that, right? He just said, it was different because I was injured. But again, you don't say that unless somewhere in your brain you were getting absolutely roasted. So I
have to share the story. There was a string of plays in training camp where it continued from the one-on-one drills to the team drills, where Everson Griffin got a quarterback quote unquote hit on 7 consecutive plays.
Oh my God! Yeah, and honestly, if he does that to Matt Khalil, I'm not going to be surprised, because, again, the body of work on Khalil's career is not particularly good. Even this season, I'm talking 3 or 4 games where I feel like he's played, better in terms of the reps, where he doesn't screw up. So, the history, it's tough. If Khalil really is, and as we all know, Khalil is a very good athlete. There's no denying that, So if his mobility is better, if all that is better, truly better, then he's right. He has a better chance at blocking Everson Griffin. Now, if the baseline for that is he couldn't block him on 7 straight plays, and now he can block him 3 out of 7 plays, that's still not very good. So,
practically back.
Yeah, exactly. So it will be interesting to see to the degree they try to, scheme out Griffin. I imagine on running plays that he might often be the backside read when they run things like zone read. But I mean, he's the guy I'm most, your defense is full of very talented players, but he's the guy I'm most worried about, obviously.
Cool. That was going to be the question I was going to close out the offense-defense matchup on, so I can just skip that.
Yeah.
So the rest of the offensive line, kind of interesting. I've always kind of highly regarded the interior for Carolina. Sounds like they're not doing as hot as they've done over the past 2 years. But just tell me a little bit more about left guard, center, right guard, kind of what the matchup or what the setup is there, because they're going up against Linval Joseph, who, for my money, is the best nose tackle in the league. PFF says it's Damon Harrison. Fine. He's up there. Tom Johnson is pretty talented for like a 32-year-old who didn't have a career before 2 years ago.
Yeah, and if I remember correctly, he gave them a lot of trouble last time they played.
Yeah.
Tom did.
Yeah.
Tom Johnson gave them quite a bit of trouble as a pass rusher.
So, and he's improved as a run defender, which the fact that he can improve any facet of his game at this point in his career is just astounding to me. But a really good situational pass rusher, an improving run defender who still gets kind of washed out on plays, especially against stronger guards, gets on skates downfield. But he's made more plays in the run game this year than I think he's ever had. And then you've got Linval Joseph. How do you see this kind of matchup between that interior versus the Panthers interior?
Yeah, no, it's a good question. So as far as the Panthers interior goes, obviously probably the biggest story on the interior this year for the Panthers is that Ryan Khalil has, basically not played. And he's basically not played since like week 8 of last year, something like that. I forget. He got hurt in the Rams game, which is somewhere around that 8, 9, 10 range. And he hasn't played since then. I mean, he played the 49ers game. And then I believe it was the Buffalo game, which was the second game of the year. He woke up with, quote unquote, a crick in his neck. And then proceeded to miss the next, 10 weeks, 12 weeks, something like that. So hell of a crick. We still don't know what that is. No one. I've yet to see anyone even speculate on what that injury is. So that's probably the biggest story. And he does a lot for, as I think centers often play a large role in terms of, communicating protections, setting protections. I know in the Carolina offense, him and Cam work closely together, and Khalil does a lot of that work, almost for Cam because he's such an experienced guy, and allows Cam to focus more on the secondary and get them into the correct pass play. And then, but it's always a conjoined effort. You'll see Cam adjust the protection too. So that's been the biggest story. I think Larson has played adequate in his absence. I don't think he's a terrible player, but you're talking about going from, a Pro Bowl level center to a guy who's, kind of in that replacement level, maybe sort of like below average starter to true backup level player. And then having to, deal with the communication issues that go along with that. In terms of the interior playing worse, there's, I think, sort of this narrative that the interior has played worse than it did in the past. For most of the season, I think that can kind of be chalked up to the liabilities that play next to them, if you will, and Darryl Williams and Matt Khalil. Trey Turner did have a particularly bad game in a big spot on Thursday night against the Eagles, where Fletcher Cox basically just destroyed him every rep they faced against each other, which again, it's Fletcher Cox, but you would hope that your Pro Bowl guard would at least put up a fight. But on the whole, I think he's played well. I actually think Andrew Norwell, at least this season, has been their best offensive line player, and played even better than Turner. So it would be unfortunate if they were to let him walk. this offseason. But on the whole, I think the interior is still very strong, and it's worth noting that Khalil said today he's going to play. He's going to start on Sunday. So
that'll be interesting.
Yeah, so it'll be interesting. The last time he tried to play, he played like 3 plays and immediately came out because he re-aggravated his neck injury. Mm-hmm. So again, kind of like the Olson situation, he's going to play, he's going to start, but does he, play, and then if he plays, does he play well? Is he fully healthy? Is he able to move around and do those things? So, I feel like the interior of the line, even though it's sort of had some struggles, I feel like mostly those players have still played up to their quality. And if they were able to get Khalil back for the stretch run, then that would turn, what was a strength potentially back into a true strength, and hopefully that would allow them to potentially make up for some of the deficiencies at tackle.
All right, let's talk about sort of the other side of the ball. We talked a lot about the offense, which is totally fine. Our listeners are pretty used to long podcasts, but
sure,
it would be good to talk about, I guess, the other side of the field. Yeah. Everyone knows about Luke Kuechly. He's playing, right. He's playing at a really high level. Maybe not defensive player of the year level, but like an elite level, doesn't really matter. And I guess K'Wan Short's having a pretty big year. Noticed that he was outgaining Linval Joseph in the Pro Bowl vote. I kind of disagree with that, but
they kind of play different positions, don't they? I mean, I guess I don't really know what Linval Joseph does. I wouldn't really call Short like a true nose tackle.
No, they're definitely not. But they take votes away from each other because it's the Pro Bowl, right? It's
right.
The tackle position.
So in that sense, I think it's kind of hard to compare them. Like who's better?
Fair enough. But K'Wan Short's having a pretty good year. Thomas Davis is playing well, but not at the level that he used to. From kind of my understanding, what's going on in the defense? Like who's effective enough on the defense that it's worth noting in terms of any matchup against the Vikings offense?
Yeah, so I think K'Wan Short is outside of Aaron Donald in the conversation for one of the best interior defensive players in the league. So he's not Aaron Donald, but
no one is. Like, do you think he's above like Fletcher Cox? Do you think that?
I don't watch enough of Cox. I don't think he's like above Cox. Certainly based on the way he played against Carolina, he's not as good as Fletcher Cox. But I don't know that that's the baseline for Fletcher Cox. So, sure. I would guess he's kind of in that neighborhood. Just based on what I've seen and just sort of the numbers on him in terms of like tackle for loss. And sacks, I think he's playing, right in that neighborhood. Whether he's just as good as Fletcher Cox, again, I don't watch Fletcher Cox on a snap-by-snap basis, so I don't know. But he's in that conversation. I would argue he's an elite interior defender. So
fair enough.
Whatever that means. Starlet Tulele, always a solid player, very, very good, run eater. Struggled a little bit he had a kind of a bad game against New Orleans, but New Orleans has one of the best, run blocking offensive lines in the league. Right. Not bad games, it happens. Mario Addison, I think is playing very well. I think he's very underrated. But sorry, what?
The sack leader on the team, right?
Him and Peppers, I believe, are tied. Is what I heard last. I haven't looked at it personally, but that's what I heard. Someone said they were tied, but I don't know if that's true. And I'd be interested to know. You have access to. I'd be interested to know how he stacks up in sort of like the, like pass rushing productivity numbers. Cause I don't know if he's one of those guys that's just getting a lot of sacks, but not generating a lot of pressure. And cause that stuff is sort of, he's not an elite pressure generator. So outside of that, it's always a little hard for me to gauge, like how much pressure is he really generating? But he is obviously, he's getting a decent number of tackle for losses and sacks combined. And I think he's playing well. Like when I watch him, I think he's
DRP.
Well.
So that's
what?
He's 35th in pass rusher productivity, which, by the way, Jared Allen in his near record year, should have been record year, I don't know, was not top 10 in pass rusher productivity. So as a rate stat, it's kind of interesting just because it doesn't, for example, discount third downs. It doesn't give you credit for a lot of things. It's an interesting stat more than it is an explanatory stat to me.
Yeah. And I think he definitely fits that category of he's not generating constant pressure, but he's good at converting the pressures he gets into sacks, But he's a good player. The way I would describe him is like, if it was like a truly elite pass rush unit, he'd be like the second best edge pass rusher, kind of thing. And then you'd have like an elite guy opposite him. But we don't have that really. And I think that's like the biggest issue on the team is that the team to a degree struggles generating pressure with 4. And in terms of like other guys to note, obviously Luke Kuechly, Thomas Davis, he's been banged up. It sounds like he might not play a whole lot again. He didn't play much against New Orleans, and when he did, he looked okay, but not great. Shaq Thompson, who I actually think has played very well for the most part when they don't ask him to cover wide receivers, which why would you in the world ask any linebacker to cover wide receivers? But they do that regularly. He's been a very, very good player for them, actually. I think some people think he's been a disappointment, but I would disagree with that. James Bradbury, who I think had a very good year last year, has been somewhat of a disappointment this year, though I think a lot of that has to do with what they're asking him to do schematically versus what they did last year. And I still think he's a solid, number one corner. Mike Adams has played, surprisingly well. Kirk Coleman has played surprisingly poorly. He's generally been kind of a bright spot for them in previous years.
I'm surprised when you look at the balance of his career.
Except for he's played well for Carolina for 2 straight years, So to begin the season, I thought he played pretty well, but lately I think he's struggled a lot more. So in that sense, it's surprising. But yeah, no, I think the main guys is really to watch out for if you're a Vikings fan are, and then Julius Peppers is still a very good player. He's just old, and he's playing more in Charles Johnson's absence. But I mean, the players to watch really are K'Wan Short, Luke Kuechly, and I guess Thomas Davis. It sounds like, interestingly, they're going to play a lot more nickel this week. So you're going to see a lot more Captain Munderland because it sounds like Shaq Thompson won't play. Right.
Yeah. He was did not practice on Thursday or today, I guess. Do you think Julius Peppers is going to pass Kevin Green on the all-time sacks list? Is that 152? Kevin Green's 160. That will put Peppers at number 3 overall.
That's a good question. I think it depends if he plays another year or not. I think if he plays another year, he probably will.
Yeah,
I think if he plays another, he definitely will. Which I think he will. I mean, it just does he get hurt? Because he looks great still. He's not an elite pass rusher anymore, but he's got like 8 sacks, and he's not playing like in a huge amount of snaps. And I think he's had like a sack fumble or 2, so he still looks very good. It's just that he's old. And he can't play his full complement of snaps, and he's not like a truly dominant player anymore. But yeah, I would say easily if he plays another year, and I think he will as long as he, doesn't break down towards the end here.
How come we hear about Jimmy Graham playing basketball all the time, but we never hear about Julius Peppers playing basketball?
Because Julius Peppers was the first overall pick?
Yeah, he played basketball in college.
Yeah, no, I'm just saying, I think that with Jimmy Graham, it's like a novelty story, right? It's like you took this guy who wasn't really a football player and whatever, he wasn't like undrafted or whatever, and now he's like a great tight end. Whereas Julius Peppers, it's like, who cares? He's like one of the best football players ever, even coming into the draft. So there's no you don't need a story about that guy. You're just like, holy shit, watch this guy play football. He's like the Cam Newton of defensive ends, where it's just like they shouldn't make people like that.
Yeah, no, that's fair. He was a walk in North Carolina. I can't get over that.
He played at North Carolina. He was a walk-on at North Carolina? I didn't even know that.
Yeah, right. So he got the scholarship to play football.
For basketball, I see. Yeah.
Well, that's more impressive, right? If you're a walk-on.
That's true. Yeah. I wasn't even thinking, but yeah, that's true. To be a walk-on at North Carolina basketball program is pretty impressive.
And he wasn't a starter, which it's North Carolina, but he scored they put him in games, right?
Right, he played. Yeah. Well, if you just watch him, he's like an absolutely, he's one of those guys that I say this about Cam Newton, where it's like, and this is true of LeBron James too, where it's like, they're like, they don't look weird. They don't have these it's not like Kevin Durant have these weird proportions. They're just like a human that you just made much, much larger, and then they move like a normal human. And it's just like, this is confusing. They're not supposed to be that big. They're not supposed to be just like moving like a normal human at, whatever he is, like 6'7", however many, 300 something pounds. So yeah, no, it makes sense that he would be able to just go play collegiate basketball and be pretty good at it.
For like the best team in the country.
Yeah, for one of the best programs in the country. Yeah, exactly.
Well, okay, let's talk about the wide receiver defensive back matchup. So the Vikings.
Oh God.
we gotta. Just grin and bear it. We've got one of the best wide receiver duos in the NFL. They've got a good claim to maybe be the best. It depends on what you think of who partners with Julio Jones, who partners with Antonio Brown, whatever. Irrelevant. They're very good.
Yeah, like top 3 at worst kind of thing.
Right, exactly. Yeah. And they're going up against, you mentioned that James Bradbury's playing well. Captain Munnerlyn is playing, right?
He's been playing. They just one of the complaints Panthers fans have had is that, or a number of us have had, is that they defend 11 personnel often in their base package when they have Captain Mcdonald, who's played at least decently well, and just makes more sense as a matchup for a slot receiver than Shaq Thompson. Because no matter how good a coverage linebacker you are, you're just not going to cover slot receivers. I'm sorry. I mean, I've yet to see an outside linebacker who can regularly cover slot receivers. So,
and then was the other one Darryl Worley?
Yeah, so that's another interesting story, is that they have kind of weirdly rotated between him and Kevon Seymour, sometimes in the same game. Both guys will play and play.
And Mackenzie Alexander, I mean, they just rotate the slot.
And they'll do that, which I think is kind of an unusual approach. And I think it's, debatable whether that's been a good idea or not. Some people prefer Worley, some people prefer Seymour. They have very different strengths. I don't really have a strong opinion one way or the other. I think maybe Worley's played a little bit better, particularly this last game. But yeah, so I guess it's probably going to be Darryl Worley, but it's a little bit tough to know whether it's going to be Darryl Worley or Kevon Seymour.
So what does the coverage look like? Is it a primarily man? Is it primarily zone? Do they follow receivers with their best cornerback? What's the deal? Like, how do you expect, when Stephon Diggs and Adam Thielen line up, what do you expect is going to happen?
Yeah, so that's interesting. So, and I don't know what the numbers look like in these days, but I will say this. So if this were last year, I would be able to tell you that they're almost certainly going to play zone. They'll do a decent amount of, stemming their coverage, disguising between 2 and single high, but it will almost always be zone coverage. And not a lot of like super complicated, like pattern match type stuff. They'll do that, but they're not like a heavy, like we're going to run these really kind of, zones that look exactly like a man type team. But this year, and again, it's interesting because I don't have the numbers because as I don't know, what Vikings fans do or don't know about the Panthers. But so Shaun Mcdermott, who was the defensive coordinator and has been for a while under Rivera, is a very highly regarded defensive coordinator. Recently, obviously, in the offseason, took the job in Buffalo. And as part of that, they promoted Steve Wilkes, who was the defensive backs coach, who was, very highly regarded throughout the league, within the organization. And throughout the offseason, when there was this narrative that they were going to play some, do more man coverage and more blitzing than they had in the past. The blitzing part has 100% been true, and often behind that blitzing will be man coverage. Now, I know early in the year when my fellow podcast co-host Billy Marshall, who's on Twitter, who you guys all should follow. I think it's like Billy M_91. Death to all people with underscores in their Twitter handles because it's confusing. So don't follow Billy because he has an underscore in his handle. But no, Billy's great. And Billy was charting, man versus zone. I don't know that he hasn't been publishing that data recently, so I don't know. But early on, actually, the numbers weren't that different. My sort of perception is that they are playing more man, but still mostly relying on zone. So Bradbury seems to, even, within sort of the zone concept, will still shadow to some degree, number one receivers. Not like every snap, but a good percentage of them. Now, I don't know if, I would guess that means he's going to defend Diggs mostly in terms of who he shadows. If he shadows, which again I think he will follow somebody, and so it's mostly a zone team, but expect a lot of blitzing and expect some man sprinkled in.
All right, and then based off of what you know about the talents of Adam Thielen and Stephon Diggs, they're probably more similar than they are different, as much as people kind of want to emphasize the differences. Very good route runners, incredible at tracking the ball.
Yeah.
Surprisingly good at contested catches, despite neither of them having the frames of people like Brandon Marshall or Kelvin Benjamin or Devin Funchess.
Yeah, frame is overrated when it comes to contested catches.
Yeah, well, I guess Panthers fans would know that.
Yeah.
But they've got a bunch of talents and skill sets to draw upon. They're both very athletic in slightly different ways, and they both can play physical. What about those two? How do you think that interacts with the defensive setup you just described, and in particular the talents among the secondary?
Yeah, so, and this is interesting because it's interesting how we tend to break these things up. So we talk about the secondary and then we talk about the pass rush. But what I would argue is that it's going to be less of a question of, can Darryl Worley cover Adam Thielen? Can, James Bradbury cover Stephon Diggs? And I think it's more of a question of how much time does Case Keenum have to throw? And how unbothered is he in the pocket? I think that, obviously I have a huge amount of respect for Diggs and I have a huge amount of respect for Thielen, but I just think that much like most teams, this Panthers team's ability to cover, particularly in their zones, has a lot to do with how well they're generating pressure. And you've seen this as the year's gone on. Earlier in the year, the team was generating pressure with their blitzing and with their front four a lot more regularly, and the defense was playing very, very, very well, but not generating any turnovers, ironically. More recently, I would argue the defense actually hasn't played that well. It's played okay, and part of the reason for that is that the blitzes are no longer generating pressure, which means coverage guys have to hold up a lot longer with fewer guys in coverage, which is obviously a bad scenario, and they're getting exposed. So I think the question for me in this game is not can Darryl Worley, not can James Bradbury, not can Captain Merlin cover those guys. And it's more a question of, is Case Keenum just going to be able to sit there and pick them apart? Because if he's mostly unbothered, then yeah, they're going to get open. They're going to make plays because they're great receivers. And these corners are, Bradbury's good. Everybody else is just okay. And to be honest, the secondary remains the weakness of the Panthers overall. So that really, to me, is the question. If you're a Vikings fan going to this game, is to watch is, are they able to bother Keenum and force him into bad decisions or quick throws? Because if they aren't, then he's going to have a field day because those guys are going to be running open all over the field.
Let's talk about the pressure matchups then. So unfortunately, Mike Remmer's probably not going to get his revenge game.
Imagine saying that. Unfortunately, no. Actually, Remmers was pretty solid here. I've talked about this. He's not a bad player.
Yeah,
he's not a great player, but he's not a bad player.
Yeah, we both did our Remmers in Carolina apologia, I think, in the offseason.
Right.
It's that's unfortunate. But Rashad Hill has played surprisingly well in his stead. More of a pass protection specialist than a run blocker, but has improved in that as well. Riley Reif has had a bit of a drop off in play, but not too much, and he's largely been an asset to the Vikings. Nick Easton, Pat Elflin at left guard and center are massively inconsistent, but have really good highlight plays and really bad low light plays and a lot more inconsistency than strengths. But Joe Berger's pretty solid, and for some reason is the top 10 of Pro Bowl voting at his position. Don't know why. Probably shouldn't be. Don't really. Not going to complain too much about it. He's playing well. So you hear that. You hear pretty decent in pass protection. Reif is more of a get your hands on a guy and win through strength kind of pass protection guy. And Rashad Hill is kind of more of an athleticism guy. You'd think that they'd switch positions based off of that description, but whatever. Based off of that, what are your thoughts about, say Mario Addison, Julius Peppers, Kenwan Short, Star Lotulelei, and sort of the role players on the defensive line? What do you think about their ability to get pressure on a Vikings offensive line that's giving up pressure at a fairly average clip with a quarterback that has had just an insane ability to avoid those pressures from turning into sacks? Lowest sack percentage off of pressure in the league.
Go Case Keenum, man, that's impressive.
Yeah, it is.
You do wonder a little bit too how much. Again, we talk about these things; they're all very interrelated. You wonder how much that has to do with the quality of the wide receivers. Just being able to create throwing lanes when you're under pressure. Because, for example, if you're under pressure and there's nowhere to throw the ball, then it's going to be a sack. That you don't have a choice. So, anyways, that I wonder about that. Just because the strength of your team is your wide receivers, I wonder how much that has to do with those guys. But anyway, so back to your question. It's a good question. So the thing that I will be interested to watch, and I think given your description of sort of how the interior has played in pass protection, is I think if it goes south for the Vikings, it'll be two things. One is that they won't be able to run the ball. I think Carolina over the years has prided themselves, and again, they've struggled with this recently, though I think I trust them to correct it at some point. The question is this week. It has been basically to be able to completely shut down teams' running games so that they have to throw the ball. And so that would be the first thing. So if they can shut down the Vikings running game, that will go a long way to them neutering what has been obviously a very, very surprisingly successful offense, given, some of the injuries and that Case Keenum is your quarterback. And the other thing I would watch out for is that I wouldn't be surprised if Kawan Short in particular is able to have a big game and sort of, derail your passing offense to a degree that a player like him is capable of having a big game. The other player that I wish I would have mentioned earlier, but I didn't, is their draft pick from a year ago, Vernon Butler. He was taken at the end of the first round. I know Charles Mcdonald, Josh Norris were both very high on him. My podcast co-host Billy Marshall was very high on him as well. He had a injury-plagued first season, then had a high ankle sprain, or at least some kind of ankle sprain. Again, early in the season, but has recently come on and played very well, particularly in the past 2 games. So I would watch out for him. He's playing, kind of around 40-ish% of the snaps these days. So I would also watch out for him to potentially make some plays on the interior, rushing the passer, and getting into the backfield to create negative plays in the running games. Because that's another thing that Carolina tends to excel at is not just stopping your run, but generating negative plays in the running game. So, to answer your question overall, I think that is to me the key to this game on that side of the ball is, do K1 Short, Vernon Butler, Star Lotulelei kind of just, and then the linebackers kind of just, destroy the running game and then are able to kind of, have those edge rushers pin their ears back a little bit more. And they may not be the best edge rushers, but in those situations, they're going to be able to potentially create more difficulties for Keenum. Surprisingly, they have had a little difficulty this year, I think, and maybe this is not based on any kind of statistic, just my perception of forcing teams into like 3rd and 15 and then like letting them convert 3rd and 15. So I won't be surprised if that happens a fair amount as well.
All right, fair enough. So are there any special teams notes that are interesting to you? Do you think the kicker, punter, or the return game has been particularly notable in one way or the other?
Yeah, actually, it's very interesting. So under Rivera, generally speaking, the Panthers have been very poor on special teams, usually, towards the bottom of the league. This year, before last game, when they just had like an absolute special teams disaster, none of which I think is repeatable. I mean, I think it was all fluky. Pilardi went to punt the ball and just dropped it and then didn't punt it. And which I like, stuff like that happens. Players make really weird mistakes every once in a while. Pilardi has actually been a bright spot. He's been, one of the best players on the team just in terms of performance relative to his position. And I think that this is sort of a weird thing to say, but, their special teams coach in the offseason passed away. So they had to hire a new special teams coach. So I think that might be playing a role, especially, we tend to see that coaching plays a significant role in special teams. The other thing I would say is that they made a more concerted effort to draft and sign more athletic players, particularly say Russell Shepard, who is sort of a special teams specialist, if you will. So I think that, they were 4th, I believe, in DVOA on special teams before last week. Again, had a very poor outing, so dropped to 8th, but they've been better in the return game. Better at punting. Gano, who had an offseason last year, has kicked very well, generally speaking. I think he's about kicking is weird, because it fluctuates, but I think he's about a league average kicker who had a bad year last year and is having a good year this year, maybe slightly above average kicker. So I think it's a very good special teams unit. It has been this year, which has been very surprising, and it's a big reason why I think that they have the record they do. Is that despite the offense kind of sputtering, the defense playing not as well lately, the special teams has given them that advantage where in the past it's been kind of a drag.
That's a pretty interesting turn of events. And, kind of one of the things that I've always found interesting about the story of the Panthers and special teams is how focused the national media has been on decisions to avert the special, going for it on 4th down and stuff like that. For the Panthers, it feels like this question about how often they go for it on 4th down is more present than it is for any other team except for the Patriots, where every time they do something, it's interesting. Right. So is there something unique or it's not what was it last year or 2 years ago where Mike Tomlin just kind of went for 2 almost every time? But like, is there something interesting about this conversation, or is it just because like, well, they've got Cam Newton, they should go for it? Like, what's the deal?
Yeah, so it is kind of an interesting conversation, actually. So yeah, I mean, part of it definitely is. It's like you have Cam Newton, probably the best short yardage weapon in the league. Between the fact that you'll see them sneak it, you'll see them just hand it off, you'll see them run a bootleg, you'll see them run play action, and honestly, usually whatever they run is relatively successful. Whether it's getting a first down or generating sometimes even a big play in some of those short yard, fourth and short situations. But I think the reason it's so interesting is there was, which season was it? I believe it was either the 2013 or I think it was the 2013 season where there was a game in Buffalo where, Rivera could have taken a gamble essentially that would have sealed the game. He didn't, and then they lost. And there sort of became this narrative, the Riverboat Ron narrative where he decided that he was going to go for it a lot more often. I think partly because he knew his job was sort of on the line to a degree. And so they were much more aggressive about going for it on fourth down. He sort of hilariously asked that he be renamed Analytical Ron because he said it was an analytical decision, which I don't think caught on.
Yeah, no way. But
and he's not analytical, so it's sort of a funny thing for him to say. But since then, he's been a lot more hit or miss, a lot more kind of back to his old conservative ways. There have been a number of times this year where, he could have been more aggressive and wasn't. I don't know that there's any one in particular where it definitively cost them the game more than it decreased their chances to win. Mm-hmm. But that's not that different than most other NFL head coaches. But I think the irony is sort of that he has sort of become in some ways, again, very conservative after sort of making a show or it becoming a big narrative that he was, much more aggressive. So it's a little odd for him to have success being more aggressive and then kind of revert to being less aggressive again. I would say lately he's, kind of been more aggressive, but it's a little weird. He seems to have no real process for deciding, whether it's a good time to go for it or not, which is, again, not that different than most NFL head coaches.
Right. Yeah. I mean, or the analytical formula that goes into determining that it's just so nuanced and specific.
Right. It's such a complicated formula.
Okay, cool. So with all of that in mind, with all of this breakdown exhaustively about the individual players on the team, how they match up with the Vikings and so on. Oh my God, we didn't even talk about the running game or the tight ends.
On your team?
Yeah.
Well, I kind of said they need to stop the running game.
If
I'm quietly optimistic that they can stop it, but again, they've struggled in recent weeks, and obviously the Vikings have been, pretty successful lately. Anyways, so I'm even though the Panthers have struggled, I'm quietly optimistic that they can kind of return to their old ways and actually have success against the running game. But if they don't, then I think that you're gonna, like I said, I think you're gonna see the Vikings have a lot of success, just in all aspects of their offense.
Just one quick question before we get into the mailbag. Should the Vikings have some success running to the outside with McKinnon, some success running to the inside with Murray? What is an approach that you would take against this Panthers defense?
That's a good question. Generally running east-west on the Panthers is not a good idea. Though at times, Kuechly and Davis can struggle to tackle kind of quicker, shiftier backs. They're very good tacklers. They're very sure tacklers, and they're very fast rallying to the ball. But they definitely can struggle sometimes wrapping up a guy or getting down a guy like Jared McKinnon. I tend to think that you'd be better off, kind of trying to run north-south. But in general, I just don't think, for most teams, running the ball on the Panthers is going to be a successful endeavor no matter what you do. Now, again, that hasn't been true lately. Some of that is the Saints is one of the best running teams in the league. And they do a lot of things with motion to create extra gaps and confuse the defense that for some reason, our coaching staff just can't figure out. So do that. Go watch the tape of what the Saints did and just copy that because it seems to give the Panthers a lot of trouble in terms of their gap integrity.
Sure. Well, this has gone on pretty long. Dusty, let's talk about, let's go to the mailbag.
Yeah, let's do that. Super interesting though, and actually, I've been like sitting here slowly curating away mailbag questions as you answer them in line.
Perfect.
So, yeah, good job.
Glad
guys.
I could answer them. Yeah.
Awesome.
It's because I knew what they were telepathically.
because I mean, everybody has the same question. Well, so that's the thing about the mailbags is that oftentimes there'll be numerous iterations of the same question every week.
Right. Yeah, that makes sense.
Definitely deleted a few. Should we start Teddy questions?
Do it. I'm still pro starting Teddy. If that's the question.
This year, like this game.
Yeah. Why not? I don't know. I don't really believe in Case Keenum like for the whole year. I mean, the problem is, I think that at this point you've kind of reached a point where the risk of starting Bridgewater in terms of maybe he just sucks now, I guess, is high enough that it's not worth doing. But
that's why you start him the last week of the regular season against Chicago. That's like it's almost as good as playing the Broncos in terms of it being a bye game.
There you go. Yeah, no, play him then. I just think that if there's a I guess the real question, I guess you really have to ask yourself is like, what is the percentage chance that Teddy Bridgewater is as good as he was sort of right before the injury? And then the second question you have to ask yourself is like, what does the percentage chance have to be such that you would replace him with Case Keenum? I guess I don't know the answer to that, but I would guess if the chance is relatively high, I would still start him.
Well, it's Keenum's job to lose, according to Zimmer.
Certainly
basically.
they're not going to be doing that anytime soon, which I understand.
Emil Ramsvik writes in, what potential offseason departure of coaching or front office personnel is going to be the biggest loss for the Vikings?
It's Pat Shermer. Done. Next question.
Scott Burkett.
That sounds right to me. I've been listening to your guys' podcast, and just from watching the Vikings, I totally agree that Shermer's done a great job. He's been a big. I think Arif, you picked him for like your most valuable player or something like that. I can't remember what you chose him for, but yeah, I mean, I kind of agree. He's done such a great job of working around the talent they have. Granted, the talent they have, outside of the quarterback position, if we don't think that Case Keenum is actually all of a sudden one of the best quarterbacks in the league, is pretty good.
Okay, so Scott Burkett writes in, if Pat Shermer takes a head coaching job elsewhere, do the Vikings roll the dice on Case next year or reset with Teddy?
I think it probably really depends on what they do in order to resolve the offensive coordinator position and what that OC wants, because I think they're going to have a lot of input. But I think there's a pretty good chance that Case is going to follow Shermer if Shermer does get a head coaching position, and that kind of makes the decision for you. I wouldn't be surprised if they re-signed both Case for an expensive contract, Teddy for a pretty cheap contract, and make them compete.
Interesting. Likely landing spots for Pat Shermer this offseason?
Chicago, that would suck.
Ugh, no, don't say that.
Yeah. Well, where do you think he could go, Scott?
Who are the vacancies going to be? That's the question, right? Who's going to get fired?
Denver, Cleveland.
Denver's going to fire their coach after 1 year?
Maybe. I mean, well, I don't know how closely you follow local blogger Ben Albright or listen to Denver Sports Radio, but the calls for Vance's head have been ongoing, and I personally didn't think he was that strong of a hire in the first place. He was never that great at CU.
Sure. That makes sense. It's just interesting to fire a coach after 1 year. Doesn't it sound like he's not going to be fired? Wasn't that sort of the reporting today that Hugh's going to be in for another year? Who knows,
but you can't trust the Browns organization to be honest with anyone in it. I mean,
well, not even honest, that they just might change their minds, tomorrow. I think that's more the issue.
Exactly. What? How did it? Was Jimmy Haslam able to feel the pee under all of his mattresses this morning?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Flip a coin. Am I going to fire Hugh Jackson today? Kind of thing. He's going to do that for 100 straight days, and if it's ever heads, then he fires Hugh Jackson.
What about? No. There's New York. Either Jets or Giants.
Yeah, right.
I believe they'll fire Bowles after.
They shouldn't get rid of Bowles. He's done, I think, a lot given the talent around him.
That would be interesting, actually. I feel like the Giants make a lot of sense.
Yeah, if they get a quarterback.
Yeah,
they have a quarterback.
Either way,
he's starting again.
Skill talent. Maybe Case Keenum comes along.
Oh yeah.
Oh no. Oh, this prognostication is uncomfortably good for me.
Yeah, I feel like that can happen.
All right. We solved
it. Yeah, boom.
I don't like that. John Belk writes in via the email. You can email us your questions at norsecodepodcast@gmail.com, should you desire. Since coaches are the only uncapped resources teams have, wouldn't it make sense from a purely competitive standpoint to give Shermer some ridiculously massive contract to stick around?
I guess. I mean, it's not as if teams have infinite money as much as we kind of act like they do. They do have to deal with like cash flow problems. It's actually the whole reason Brady keeps restructuring his contract, because he's not getting more money, and it's not changing the cap environment too much. It's to impact the cash flow for the Patriots. So sometimes teams with low amounts of cap space being used up will actually have a high amount of cash flow going out. That actually happened to the Oakland Raiders not too long ago when they got rid of everybody and had $53 million in dead cap space. That also meant that they had this huge cash flow problem where they couldn't offer that much in terms of signing bonuses. And so that's a thing that you have to deal with when you've got, I mean, because they're still like business enterprises, even if like some owners would prefer to run them at a loss and some owners would prefer to run them as profit-making ventures. It's difficult to offer enough money to an offensive coordinator. That said, I think that everybody who's not a head coach is grossly underpaid anyway, and that teams have the ability to pay them a lot more, and that this cash flow thing is just kind of like a theoretical problem. Could you like do what Alabama did with Kirby Smart for so long, where he kept on turning down head coaching offers until like this last year because he kept on he got like $6 million? Maybe. I don't think the Vikings will do it.
Mike Raver writes in, can you talk about the significance that this game has on tiebreakers with the Eagles? If one team loses and the other wins, it'll be tantamount to a 2-game lead, assuming we end in a conference tie with one AFC game left apiece, which are both, admittedly, pretty easy.
Why would it be it tantamount to a 2-game lead because it would lead to a change in the total amount of conference in the conference record? Is that?
Well, it would be so if we, assuming we win the AFC game, we would end in a conference tie. Assuming that the Eagles win their AFC game as well.
Right, but I'm just confused about the question. Like, why is it a 2-game lead? The Vikings are tied in record with the Eagles, and if the Eagles like lose to the Rams and the Vikings win against the Panthers, that puts the Vikings 1 game ahead. And if they it'd be 2 because the Vikings already hold the tiebreaker, maybe?
Yeah.
Maybe. I mean, the tiebreaker is like strength of victory. And so if like the teams that the Vikings have beaten start losing a bunch and the teams that the Eagles have beaten start winning a bunch, that could change. So I wouldn't really count it tantamount to a 2-game lead. But yeah, okay, yeah, sure.
Well, but are the Rams really going to lose a bunch? Like how many games do they really have left to lose?
A lot. I don't know. They're also kind of a weird team. I don't know. It's all like theoretical, but like, strength of victory is not like a solid enough time. It's not like head to head where you're like, yeah, that's it. It's a 2-game lead. It changes. I don't know. If the Vikings win this one and the Eagles lose, and they both win their AFC matchups, it makes it, pretty likely that the Vikings will take the number 1 spot. But I think, it's always going to be contingent upon what the other team does. So, the Vikings have a slight advantage, and this would magnify that advantage pretty dramatically, but I wouldn't call it, a 2-game lead.
All right. Don from Ohio writes in, which is more likely to happen? And Scott, I want your take on this as well. Matt Khalil giving up no sacks and not committing a penalty, or James winning the consolation tournament in the Norse Code Final Fantasy League? Scott, just for clarity, I mean, I know you enjoy our show, which, by the way, thank you. James is 0-12. He is bottom seed in the consolation league.
Then is it over?
Well, no, he's the bottom seed in the
in the consolation
league.
Right. Got it. And where is he in points?
He has either the highest or second highest points against. He has suffered, I think, 150 or 175 points against in missed extra point penalties. So his points for is absurdly low because the Steelers
honestly,
kicker
I haven't done the math, but wouldn't it just be worth it not to play a kicker in that league?
But you can't. You have to play a kicker.
Oh, you have to play a kicker.
And this created 2 individual points of controversy during this season because I foolishly forgot to set my lineup the week that Denver was on a bye, and I ended up losing that game, so it didn't really benefit me to not start a kicker. But there was somebody else in the league who also forgot to set his lineup one week and had a kicker on a bye and ended up winning by...
Controversial.
So I don't think the kicker in question missed any extra points, so the penalty didn't come into play, but it was a closer victory than if he had missed an extra point. So I think we just sort of like brushed it under the rug and claimed that there was no actual influence on the outcome of the game. Like if it had been a situation where homeboy had missed 2 extra points and that would have been the difference in the game, then we might have had to go in and adjust wins. But as far as it went, no harm, no foul. But the rule is you have to draft one kicker and you have to start a kicker every week.
Gotcha. Yeah. I mean, regardless, I think the answer is that he'll win the higher chance he'll win the consolation tournament, because I'll be floored if Khalil, because to be honest, Khalil could play well and give up 1 sack or have a hold. So I can't imagine that he won't do one of those 2 things.
I estimate there is a 5% chance of either thing happening.
They're about the same?
Yeah.
Equal?
Well, and that's the beauty of Don's question, is that they're both like the least, like it's the stoppable force versus the movable object. They are both incredibly unlikely things to have happen.
That's fair. I just feel like, Khalil, I feel like it's basically 0. And I feel like, I don't know how bad his team is, I guess, but I feel like he's got about, I feel like it's almost 0 for Khalil and about 5% for
So it's a battle of who wants it less.
Yeah, exactly.
Don follows up. If you were given the board game Public Assistance as a Christmas gift, would you actually play it or resell it on eBay, or would you just throw it away?
Oh, you gotta play it. You gotta play it.
It's $700 in the shrink wrap.
That's true. You actually do gotta sell it, but I feel like you have to play it. I don't know. It just seems like you gotta see what the mechanic is like, and it's fun. I mean, it's funny. Like, it's so bad that it's funny.
We're gonna include a link to the Amazon page for Public Assistance in the show notes, because this I wanted to make sure that everybody was prepared for this question before the show. And
oh my God! And this derailed us for about an hour.
It led us to 45 minutes of borderline racist board games. That oh my gosh! Well, look, you have something to look forward to in the Christmas episode this year. We'll include at least a couple of choice clips from our pre-show discussion this week. But I just wanted on the record that Public Assistance is an amazing piece of Americana, and like
it really is.
Once you
and
take
it's a
the plastic
item now.
Well, and once you take the plastic bag off and like open the crappy shrink wrap on all the different cards inside, like the value of the game probably goes down a lot. And I would rather just like keep it around so that I could go and spoil other people's game nights. Like you got nerd friends, you have board game nights every so often, and people are encouraged to bring games. Well, rather than like playing Exploding Kittens or Settlers of Catan for the 900th time, I would love to show up at a party with Public Assistance.
Is it worth $700 for you to ruin someone's board game night?
Not just one person's.
And just pretend, the best part is to bring it and just pretend like there's nothing wrong with it.
Yeah,
like it's
just pretend like you never played it before, game, like you didn't know. Hey guys, I got this new game.
Really normal board game.
And you're like, oh yeah, I got the ethnics lawyers. The ethnic lawyer got me off on a technicality.
The free ethnic lawyer from the Justicare program. This do yourself a favor and click on the link in the show notes. This game is
I was quoting directly from one of their like community chest / treasury pieces they get. Like, it's incredible.
It's truly incredible, and thanks to Don from Ohio for sharing that with us. I feel like throwing it away is the worst play.
Yeah.
Sheldon Hofer writes in, were we just spoiled by having Patterson last year, or is the special teams just not as good as far as the return game? It just doesn't seem like we've gotten any big plays this year.
I mean, both. Like, I think the special teams unit overall is kind of just dropped, but I think Patterson was a singularly talented, kickoff returner, and maybe the best kickoff return in NFL history. Certainly in sort of the top 5 historically. When you get rid of that guy, of course it's going to fall off. But I also think that there have been some problems since been resolved by having Sherrills as a kick returner because I think he's done well. But yeah, I mean, it's always going to feel like that after. I mean, like, yeah, it's the best that we've seen in like decades. Of course, it's going to fall off.
The best guy ever, yeah. But so Drew McGarry had a semi-hot take, a lukewarm take about how we should just abolish kickoff returns, period, because it's pretty rare for returners to get past the touchback line consistently. Yeah.
So I hated that, but then I saw a video from John Boyce on SB Nation about why they should get rid of the kickoff. And I wish I remembered the arguments in the video, but it was like really well argued, and I think it kind of convinced me. But now I can't remember the individual arguments, so I'm really making a good case for it right now. Watch it. It's great. John Boyce makes some great videos on the internet.
See, I think they should eliminate kicking altogether, but that's,
But then
I mean, Vikings fans are not that upset with that idea.
Yeah, I'm actually pretty okay with that.
No kicking, no punting, and I think the game would be far more interesting.
But just think about how many more non-sports fans
right?
you
Because
have
you still want to have that math where field goals are like, just they suck, right?
Right. Yeah, sure. I don't know how you do the scoring if you can't kick. I guess everybody has to go for two. Some people suggested that you you can either just take 1 point or you can go for two. I don't know.
I like that one. Take 1 point or go for two.
No, that's my favorite. Because I always, do you remember, this was like a long time ago, but it was like to make the playoffs, and the Saints had this I think it was the Saints, had this like incredible return. It was the last game of the season for a touchdown. And then who was the
John
kicker?
Casey, I think?
John Casey? Wasn't it John Casey? Comes out and just misses the extra point.
Yeah, John Boyce made a video about that too. Great video.
And it was like, this is terrible. Like, I feel bad for the kicker. I feel like everything about this is bad. There's nothing good about this. So I just wish we would get rid of that. And instead, they made the extra point harder, which made a lot of sense.
Well, I actually like the increased difficulty of the extra point, and not just because it makes James lose every game every week in the North Code Fantasy League. I think
to me, that's the only reason to like it.
Well, I like the randomness as far as extra points are no longer a guarantee.
See, I don't think football needs more randomness. I think football needs less randomness. But yes, I understand why. I totally get why people would find that appealing.
It's a watchability thing, I guess. Not that there aren't enough unwatchable teams anyway. Caleb Arndt writes in, how concerned should we be about Kai Forbath going into the playoffs, considering Zimmer teams tend to play close games?
I don't think they play that many close games, actually. I think we just assume that they do because they've got a strong defense.
Right, and if you look at the final score, there's a fair amount of garbage time points scored against the Vikings.
Right, which would not be an issue. So, yeah, not really. That's not a huge worry. Kai Forbath has been infuriating. How many games has he actually lost for the Vikings? One? There's only been 2 losses.
So he's responsible for 50% of all the Vikings' losses. That's I don't know if I like that statistic when I say it going into the playoffs.
Yeah, when you put it like that, I'm not worried.
You put it like that, he's one of the worst players in the NFL. I mean, how many guys can you say are responsible for 50% of their team's losses?
It's a good point. I retract everything I've said.
Kyle P. Slaby writes in, is Devin Funchess good? I feel like he makes some plays and some nice grabs, but is inconsistent.
Yeah.
Yeah, so we talked about this. I think he's good. I think he's solidly good at this point. The question is, does he get beyond good?
Get good. Jesus.
Flag Husband. Great name. Writes in with a question for me. Oh, thank you. How into the Colorado beer scene are you, and what is your favorite Colorado beer? I am less into the beer scene than I was, 5 to 8 years ago, and partly because the number of breweries has increased to a point where I would just never be sober if I wanted to keep up on it. And I do occasionally have actual work to do, so that is not tenable for me. I think the Denver beer scene specifically has exploded and is, okay. There's a couple of standouts. I think Prost Brewing in particular makes some really great classic German style beers, which is kind of a nice antidote to the super bitter hop beer craze that Colorado kind of helped start. But having said that, My favorite beer when I first moved to Colorado, like 10 years ago, was Avery Brewing Company's IPA. And that is more or less still true. Avery is definitely my favorite brewery in Colorado just because they do every style and they experiment a lot with fun barrel-aged finishes. They have a lot of super limited releases, a lot of super delicious rare beers that, if you're the kind of person that buys alcohol as an investment, there's some really classic releases that go for significantly more money than they were ever sold for on eBay. And I just think as far as, creativity and brewing technology go, they're pretty much setting the course for other breweries to follow. But there's just so many here that it's hard to stay focused. If I had to pick top 3 breweries, I would say Avery, Odell, and Prost. And they've all got different medals in different categories from the Great American Beer Festival to back that up. My favorite beer of all time, however, is not a Colorado beer, and I'm just plugging it now because it's seasonal and it's available now. They released the first batch of Sierra Nevada Celebration Ale, which is like their dry hopped, like winter ale type beer, the same week that I was actually born in December 1981. And it remains my favorite beer of all time. Every annual expression is a little different because they vary up the malt bill and the hop bill every year, depending on what, grew well at Sierra Nevada. But Celebration Ale, check it out. It's the best winter seasonal that you will ever have.
I actually really enjoy Celebration Ale, and you guys know I'm not a huge beer drinker, so strong endorsement from Dusty, kind of strong endorsement from me.
Kenneth Allen writes in, what's the worst matchup for us in this game? Their linebackers versus our running backs? That's one thing we didn't go into a ton of detail on, but it seems like, Scott, that's kind of what you think is a liability.
Yeah, I would say, again, I would reject thinking of it as linebackers versus running backs versus like interior line plus interior line and interior defensive line versus linebackers and running backs. And I would say, that kind of interior, definitely the advantage to the Panthers there. That is probably their strongest advantage in the game. Which maybe at quarterback, but that's not really like, the quarterbacks don't play each other, so it doesn't really make sense. But yeah, I think I would say that probably is accurate. Arif, can you think of anywhere else there would be a matchup that is, less advantageous for the Vikings that would compare to that particular matchup?
You mentioned that there's like 2 elite players for the Panthers that are kind of defining their respective sides of the ball, and so the one that focuses on Luke Kuechly makes a ton of sense to me because, as you had mentioned early in the podcast, quarterback play is so interrelated with it. There's no matchup. It's like Cam Newton versus Harrison Smith. That doesn't really make sense. Yeah. So,
right. And that's true of all the positions to some degree or another.
Yeah, it does,
especially with quarterback.
Yeah. So I would say the linebacker versus running back one is one that's maybe presents the most potential pitfalls for the Vikings. Like on the other side of the ball, I'm pretty confident in the wide receiver cornerback matchup.
Yeah.
Kind of on both ends. So
100%.
I would say linebacker, run back.
Yeah, and I would say, I said Cam Newton and Luke Kuechly. I would say that, Kawan Short borders on that elite category, especially when he's playing well.
And a Carolina-themed food question. What is the best regional barbecue style? North Carolina gets my vote. Says Kenneth.
I like Texas, but I don't think anyone else does.
Yeah, I don't have a strong opinion. I haven't eaten a lot of regional barbecue, but yeah, I think I would probably, of the limited experience I have, I'd probably agree with Arif, but that is something that I would like to, at some point, particularly make my way to Charleston, and they have Texas barbecue and good quality Carolina barbecue next to each other. So, South Carolina barbecue, I guess. Whole hog, Rodney Scott, whole hog barbecue next to each other. So I would like to make that trek at some point, but I have not yet.
So Texas and North Carolina style are the most similar to each other. North Carolina style is widely considered to be the oldest style of barbecue cooking, with lots of like Caribbean and African influences.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, it's pretty cool. But I'm with Arif on this one. I like Texas mop sauce. I enjoy vinegar based sauces, but I like the preparation of Texas barbecue. Maybe I enjoy whole hog barbecue, but there's nothing better than the crispy ends of a brisket that's had multiple doses of mop sauce on it. So that's
hard to disagrue with that.
Yeah. Hayden writes in, what was the worst class you took in college?
I didn't even finish college.
So the last one then?
Yes. I didn't do so hot in that one, but actually probably my computer science class, the intro to computer science class, not because obviously I dislike computer science or anything like that or the subject matter. In fact, some of the most interesting stuff I read was in that class. It's just I had such an awful professor and it's such an awful teaching process. And they were attempting to teach programming with as if, and they assumed that everyone had already known how to program in the language that they chose, which is a very frustrating process if you don't already know how to code in that language. So that's probably the worst college class I ever took.
Scott?
Yeah, that's a good question. I don't feel like I took any classes that particularly stand out as being really bad. I did drop a class that I went to one day of. It was supposed to be some kind of social. It was back in the early days when I was just on Twitter and was considering writing about basketball, potentially even for a living. I used to write for a site called Harvard Paroxysm that was relatively sort of famous in the basketball blogosphere era. I even went and covered Summer League and covered a Blazers game. But anyways, so I took this social media, I don't even remember what the premise of it was supposed to be, but I showed up to the class and it was a one time a week 4-hour class, which
Ugh.
And then they didn't have a textbook. It was still being the textbook they were going to use was still in the process of being published. And the class had not really a syllabus, but the only thing that they definitely knew was that there was going to be a group project that was most of the grade. And I was yeah, I'm not going to do this. There's no way. This sounds horrible. But outside of that, so I didn't really even take that class, but outside of that, nothing. I heard a lot of horror stories. I definitely heard of classes that were where the professor was borderline abusive to students and weird stuff like that. But yeah, no, I personally never took a class that stands out as being particularly bad.
I had, when I was at UND, I had an intro to computer science class that was taught by a visiting Chinese professor who had extremely limited English skills.
Oh, no.
And our department head was fluent in Mandarin, despite being from North Dakota. And almost everybody in our class went to him during office hours at some point during the semester to complain about how no one could understand Dr. Chen. And his solution was for everyone to sit closer.
Oh, no. That's awful.
Yeah. Honorable mention, I think, goes to... Well, so I got an associate's degree in computer information systems here at a community college in Colorado, which if I'd had to pay for it, I would have thought it was a total scam because the Microsoft Office class had a ludicrously expensive textbook. And I'm doing air quotes right now around textbook because it was just a big stack of paper shrink wrapped together. Not only did you have to pay $250 for a textbook that just described all the features of Microsoft Office, but you had to get the textbook because there was a disc of exercises that were the homework. Someone was making a lot of money selling this garbage textbook, and the worst insult was that you had to buy a binder to put the textbook in.
What?
Yeah.
Everything is wrong about this.
Yeah, and the thing was, I was look, I've already I'm pretty I was taking this Microsoft Office class at the same time I was taking advanced Cisco network configuration classes. But it was a prerequisite for graduation. They were well, you can have your associate's degree, but you have to just give us this money and put up with this nonsense class. So that was
sounds like a college to me.
Did you learn how to access the pinball game inside of Microsoft Word? Is that they teach that?
They
did not, but luckily I was aware of it. I
didn't even know that was a thing.
If there's
a
an extra
pinball game
project
inside of Microsoft Word,
I think it's only in Word 97.
Oh,
yeah, it's gone now. It's not in the cloud
version. That's still the one I use, actually.
I guess other honorable mention would go to my cultural anthropology class at UND, which was taught by a hummingbird.
What?
That sounds frustrating.
Yeah, no, I mean she was really smart and really committed to her field, but she was incredibly disorganized and would there were so many frequent micro distractions in her lectures where she would just get off on a tangent and then profusely apologize and get back to it that I estimated about 35% of her lectures were her apologizing for getting off track.
Oh, it's like the podcast then.
Yeah, except we don't apologize. and this podcast costs significantly less than that course did.
True.
So I think that's going to do it. During the course of the interview, I happened across an article from Patreon where they explained themselves a little bit more, basically saying that they are doing this to their payment system to prevent people from signing up to donate and then canceling before the first of the month, or for people getting double charged. If you become a patron on November 27th and then it charges you November 27th and December 1st, that isn't fair either.
But there's a ton of solutions to that don't. That's a cop out. There's a ton of solutions to that.
Yeah, and we'll include a link to their explanation in the show notes. But really, what the problems they're claiming to solve are not problems that we have ever had, and those solutions come at significant cost to the majority of our donors who are small dollar donors. So read it and see what you think. And if you don't feel like Patreon is a good solution for you, if you do, patreon.com/NorseCode. I would recommend donating more than $1, so we get more than 60% of your donation. But yeah, paypal.me/NorseCode if you want to just throw some money in the tip jar. I think fee-wise, the fees that we get charged, the amount of money that PayPal takes before we get the rest is approximately commensurate to Patreon, but we won't know until the new Patreon thing happens, which happens on December 18th. So yeah, register your pleasure or displeasure with the new system as you like in the show notes. Be sure to check out Public Assistance, the board game. It's really a thing. It's amazing. Scott Leedy is at Marxist Panther on Twitter, and be sure to check out the Missed Opportunities podcast with Billy Marshall of Cat Scratch Reader. And people can search for your name and find your YouTube channel where you occasionally do film work, right?
Yeah, and actually, I mentioned the sort of issue with the Panthers in terms of their max protect and that kind of messing with some of their passing schemes. The sort of literal thing I described, I actually did a short video on. It's called it just says Week 7 Breakdown on my YouTube page. So if you find my YouTube page, my name's Scott Leedy. There should be links to it. Hopefully in my, I'll link to it if it's not already on my Twitter page. So you can find it there as well. Oh, and my last name's Leedy.
Yeah, we'll probably throw a link in the show notes for people who are interested in checking it out.
Perfect.
But yeah, thanks for being on the show, Scott. This was awesome. That was a fantastic interview and a glorious pre-show. I'm glad we got to share borderline racist board games together.
I don't think we need to put in borderline, but yeah, absolutely.
Right. Thinly veiled racist.
Thinly veiled.
Some more than others.
And classist. It runs the gamut. And sort of sexist, weirdly. It's got it all.
Well, Redneckopoly was primarily classist. I don't know if that's...
Oh yeah, that was almost only classist. I was speaking of the public assistance game.
Oh, public assistance is really, really racist. That's...
Yeah,
there's no disagreement on that point.
Yeah.
But yeah, that's going to do it for episode 214 of Norse Code. Come back next week when James and Arif dissect our impending victory over the Carolina Panthers.
You're probably right.
But until then, demand excellence. Demand Norse Code. Norse Code is the largest and only division of Norse Code LLC. You can find Norse Code on the Daily Norseman, SB Nation's Vikings blog at dailynorseman.com. You can also find it on iTunes, Stitcher, Google Play Music Podcasts, or wherever else fine podcasts are aggregated. Our Vikings blogger extraordinaire and generally useful human is Arif Hassan, who can be found on Twitter at Arif Hassan NFL. Our intrepid producer and occasional co-host James Pagachnik can be found on Twitter at Big Mono or curating the official Norse Code Twitter feed at NorseCodeDN. I'm your host with a firm grasp of the obvious, Dusty O'Connell,
and my name is my handle on Twitter. If you'd like to donate a few bucks to the show, your one-time donation can be made at paypal.me/NorseCode, or a recurring monthly contribution can be made by visiting patreon.com/NorseCode. Please visit our website, norsecodepodcast.com, where you'll find links to our Facebook and YouTube pages, along with the episode archive and some other good stuff. And any questions or comments that won't fit in a tweet can be emailed to norsecodepodcast@gmail.com. And on behalf of the entire Norse Code staff, thank you so much for listening.
Our formula is this. We go out, we hit people in the mouth.